So firstly, thank you all for joining us. Much appreciated to get some of your time to take you through today our global gas market outlook from 2026 to 2040, and I'll talk about that time period in a moment. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Peter Thompson. I'm a director here at Baringa, and I look after much of the work we do in gas and LNG, especially around market analysis and fundamentals. I'm joined by my colleague Giovanni Bettinelli, who you will hear from in a few minutes, and he's a manager in the same team and is responsible for much of the modelling work that we do and the analysis that's behind the kind of thing that we're going to be sharing with you today. If I just talk quickly about the agenda, we're going to break this down into three pieces. Fundamentally, we're going to talk a little bit about the role of LNG and the significance of LNG in the context of this time period. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the European gas market. I don't need to tell people on this call, I'm sure, that the changes that have happened and are happening and will continue to happen in the European gas market are one of the defining characteristics and drivers of future global developments for natural gas. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end doing a bit of reflection, some conclusions and takeaways as we see it. We would encourage you to ask questions throughout. I think you should be able to do that using the chat function in the Teams meeting. We'll try and handle those, if it's appropriate to do so, as we're going along. So if there are particular questions around content as we're going through it, we'll try and feed those in. Otherwise, we'll pick up questions at the end, leave a little bit of time at the end so we can both address any questions that have been asked throughout, but also if you have anything else you'd like to ask at that point. On the next slide, I promised I'd explain the time period to you. Some of you may have joined previous webinars that we've done in natural gas market analysis and projections, and inevitably in the last year and a half, a lot of time and effort has been spent analysing the crisis and the consequences of the crisis. The crisis being, of course, the breakdown of Russian gas supply to Europe and the consequences of that. And so for the last 18 months or so, much of the focus of market analytics has been on the how that crisis plays out, security of supply considerations in Europe. I think there remains a keen focus on storage levels and LNG flows and supply demand fundamentals. What we want to talk about today, though, is what we are describing here as the new normal. So the period post 2026. And why 2026? Well, 2026 is a time when a significant volume of new LNG supply will enter the market. This is supply that's already under construction. It's being developed and built as we speak, and indeed there are new final investment decisions being taken fairly frequently at the moment. And so the wall of new supply that starts to enter the market probably in 2025, but certainly in 26 and 27, is likely to rebalance the world and take us out of this period of structural undersupply and high disruption, as we describe it here, and into something else. So the focus of today is to try and think a little bit about what that world. I'll hand you over now to Giovanni, who's going to take you through the bulk of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Pete. So we're going to start our outlook for the long-term evolution of the global gas market by focusing on the role of LNG. If we move on to the next slide, we can see how the LNG is expected to be the key driver for meeting growing gas demand at a global level for a variety of reasons. First of all, LNG in the very short term is playing a pivotal role in replacing Russian supply within Europe. We've seen the very rapid increase in LNG imports within Europe, and as a result, we expect LNG imports in Europe to remain higher for longer as a result of the phase out of Russian pipeline supply. LNG is also, however, key to meeting growing gas demand, especially from Asian markets, which are expected to drive the bulk of global gas demand growth for as long as global gas demand will continue growing. And therefore, LNG will increase, the demand for LNG will increase at a global level, and LNG will increase its share in the global in meeting global gas demand. Now, the reason why this is possible and why LNG is enabled to take this growing importance in meeting gas demand is the fact that there is plentiful available supply, fundamentally from the US, but also from Qatar and Russia at a relative low cost, but also by the fact that we have a developing global market with more flexibility and liquidity, as has somewhat been demonstrated by the events of 2022, which have shown the ability of LNG to flex trade patterns to meet rising demand in Europe rapidly and effectively. If we move on then to the next slide, we can look at more specifically how we project LNG supply and demand to evolve in the period to 2040. So if we focus first on the left-hand chart on this slide, we look at our projection for change in LNG supply between 2040 and 2021. And as I've said, the key source for incremental energy supply is projected to be and to remain the United States throughout this period, with new capacity coming online in the United States throughout this period being required to meet global demand and fundamentally keep setting the competitive benchmark for pricing for new projects elsewhere in the world. In terms of other sources of LNG supply, we also have Qatar, very importantly, with the 2 large-scale expansions currently being planned and some potential for further expansions as well. We also have the big uncertainty of Russia with large-scale plans, especially before the events of 2022, for expanding LNG supply from Russia. Now, a lot of uncertainty persists as to whether these plans will actually be realized or not, and the uncertainty remains on whether Russia is able to access Russian technology and finance to develop the supply. Nevertheless, cheap and plentiful gas is available in Russia to be exported as LNG. If we look then in the evolution of demand, on the right-hand side of the chart, the evolution of demand is fundamentally, in the short term, in the period to 2030, a story of Europe in the very short term. As we've seen, the demand growth has already manifested itself, but also in the rest of the decade, in the rest of the 2020s, fundamentally from China, which will drive global demand growth. Somewhat in the period to 2030, but especially between 2030 and 2040, then we expect a combination of Southeast Asia, India, and other South Asian markets to drive global energy demand growth. Now, the potential for that LNG demand is there, but whether this LNG demand actually manifests itself and comes into the market depends on a range of factors, which we will discuss later. If we move on to the next slide, then we can start focusing a little bit in more detail as to how we expect this energy supply addition to come online. The chart we've just shown in the previous slide showed how we had roughly 300 million tons of new LNG supply, million tons per annum of new LNG supply coming online in the period to 2040. Well, we already have around 140 million tons per annum under construction before the start of 2023, and a large number of projects, a large volume of new supply that could take a final investment decision this year and therefore enter the market by 2027, 2028, fundamentally driving 2/3 of that increase to 2040 in the very short term. So this represents a massive wave of new supply entering the market in a very short period of time. Now, some of that supply obviously is required in the market to meet the rising demand from Europe in the very short term, but this is well in excess of the requirement from Europe in the short term, and therefore, for the market to be balanced, we require demand growth elsewhere in the world to absorb this rise in supply. This rise in supply is overall, as Pete has already described, expected to drive prices down from the current level and from the highs of the last few months to more sustainable long-term averages by 2026. But if the demand growth to absorb this new supply does not manifest itself in the global market, then we have the concrete risk of a prolonged period of depressed prices at the end of the decade. Fundamental drivers that might cause this are an underwhelming growth in demand, especially from China. I've talked about how China is a key driver of demand growth in the period to 2030, and any further evolution of the geopolitical crisis in relationship with Russia And if any volume of Russian gas supply in Europe is sustained or increased, then this will obviously contribute to the flooding of the market, but also the level of demand reduction within Europe, the success in the aggressive targets for reduction of gas demand, but also the level at which demand within Europe is permanently destroyed by high and very volatile prices. This is the outlook for the short term for the rest of the decade. The outlook is, as I said, one of a large volume of new supply entering the market and potentially depressing prices. But if we move forward into the further evolution in the market in the next slide, then we look at a scenario in which it is potentially increasingly more difficult in the longer term to bring new supply into the market. This is because LNG projects require long-term certainty of offtake. The traditional model for bringing new projects to the market is long-term commitment to offtake, and this is becoming increasingly difficult in an environment in which long-term evolution of demand is made uncertain by decarbonization pledges. But also we have traditional lenders that find it increasingly more difficult to participate in this kind of unabated oil and gas projects. So it may be more and more difficult to bring new supply into the market, regardless of the fact that there is short-term demand for LNG. Nevertheless, there are ways in which projects and developers of new supply are adapting to these challenges. We're seeing a lot of these patterns already developing in the market. First of all, we see new technologies being developed to allow more flexibility, and especially flexibility in the long term. There's a number of LNG projects, both on the supply but also on the import side, that are being developed with an energy transition story, with some potential for the development of either CCS or long-term hydrogen ammonia supply. Also, projects are increasingly competing to reduce their emission intensity. There's increasing value being attached to the emission intensity of LNG, and projects are trying to differentiate themselves between other projects. If there is only a small number of new projects to be developed, then those with the lowest carbon intensity are likely to have a competitive advantage. Also, if it is increasingly difficult to take long-term commitments to new supply, there are market participants that are willing to take that risk, that long-term risk, and these are mostly represented by portfolio players, the likes of BP, Total, and Shell, who take that long-term volume risk, often sell a significant portion of those volumes on shorter-term contracts, and effectively take a long position in the market with the view that they will be able to place those volumes in the long term. But nevertheless, this is a fairly risky position to be taken compared to the standard business model of LNG projects. Interestingly, also, if it is more and more difficult to develop new projects as time passes, as the world moves more and more towards peak gas and peak LNG, then we might see a rush for the development of new projects. And this is partly playing into what I discussed in the previous slide, where we looked at the large volume of new supply potentially entering the market. But also, finally, we are also seeing some collaboration between importers starting to emerge, with some deals being done in Asia, for example, to collaborate and to manage the uncertainty for the long-term evolution of demand. And buyers are looking for anything that helps them address this long-term uncertainty for the evolution of their demand, either with suppliers or with other buyers, in a way that mutual needs can be addressed and that uncertainty be reduced. Then we've painted a picture then for the evolution of the LNG market at a global level. What we're going to do in the next slides and in the next section is to focus more specifically on the long-term impact of the events of the last 18 months on the European market. So first of all, we are going to look at the evolution of the European gas supply mix. And the chart on the left shows very clearly the sharp reduction in pipeline imports, mostly caused by the reduction in the Russian gas supply into 2030 and 2040, and the role that LNG has taken in replacing that supply. And fundamentally, that LNG has been the one key source of flexible supply that we expect to be called upon by Europe in the period to 2040 to replace those lost supply volumes. And regardless of the fact that this is a projection which we do have a material reduction of gas demand in Europe by 2040. Now, this is not a scenario which we are necessarily moving towards net zero or having all carbon targets being met. Nevertheless, in this scenario, we still have a very high reliance on LNG in the period to 2040. And if we focus then on the chart to the right, you can see that by 2040, European LNG imports are still materially above 2021 levels, regardless of the reduction in overall European gas demand. A couple of other interesting points also, the fact that we expect Germany to rapidly become the largest LNG importer in Europe from previously not having imported LNG before 2021, and to remain so in the period to 2040, not only to meet its own domestic gas demand, but as we will see, as an entry point for some of the neighboring markets. If we move on then to the next slide, we can focus more specifically on a potential impact of a complete phase out of Russian supply. What we've just looked at is a scenario of the evolution of the European market by sustaining current levels of Russian gas imports to 2040. If we look at a complete phase out of Russian gas supply by 2030, then this has an increasing, this results in an increasing call on LNG to meet demand, and we can see in the bar chart to the left what the increasing LNG demand, what countries make up that increasing LNG demand. And we can see that fundamentally this happens in two regions, Northwest Europe and Southeastern Europe, mostly, however, in Northwest Europe. This is because Northwest Europe has a very well-developed LNG importing infrastructure. It is very well connected to other neighboring markets and therefore can represent a key entry point for LNG supply. It already has, but even in a scenario of a permanent shutdown of Russian gas supply, this is where we expect that incremental LNG supply to come into the market. And if we move then to the chart to the right, we can see the impact that a permanent shutdown in Russian supply has on the dynamics of how gas moves within Europe. And as we've just said, this demonstrates the fact that Northwest Europe, especially the Netherlands and Germany, become the key entry point for that gas to reach landlocked markets in Central and Eastern Europe. We also have some increased utilization of terminals in Poland, and Poland acting more as an entry point for LNG supply within the rest of Europe, but also, as I said, some additional gas coming from Greece being developed, being supplied to the neighboring markets.
Just before we move on, Giovanni.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We've got a question which I think we could address now. Might be useful from Katarzyna, which is what is the current utilization of LNG import and distribution infrastructure, and are there significant bottlenecks?
So
do you want to answer something on that? Yeah.
Yep. So at the moment, we are very much in a state of flux when it comes to European LNG infrastructure. We have a lot of projects being developed or close to becoming operational, so that the utilization of infrastructure at present is not necessarily a good representation of the long-term evolution. As I said, we expect, though, in the period to 2040 for Northwest Europe to maintain being a key entry point for LNG supply, because the interconnection infrastructure is there, but also because demand in some of the Northwest European countries can decrease faster than other, for example, Central and Eastern European markets. So there is the ability to move gas from Northwest Europe. There are some infrastructure bottlenecks from other countries, for example, from Poland, from Southeast Europe, and this somewhat limits the role that they can play. And this is why with the focus here has been on Northwest Europe. It's because those bottlenecks are less present. Overall, however, we don't expect there to be a limitation posed by constraints in infrastructure capacity and inability to develop new capacity in the long term. We don't expect there to be a constraint to the growth of LNG imports in Europe. If there is demand, then the necessary amount of LNG will be brought to Europe.
Maybe just to add one comment on that, you may be aware that in the last year or so, 18 months, there was indeed bottlenecks of LNG regas infrastructure. So you saw continental European regas terminals in France and the Netherlands and elsewhere being essentially fully utilized, and the interconnector with the UK and the smaller interconnector with Spain both being used effectively as a means of getting LNG from those countries across into continental Europe. And at times those bottlenecks led to some price dislocation. So you had NBP, the UK gas price, disconnecting from TTF, the Dutch and continental European price index, as a reflection of those bottlenecks. And you also saw a large differential between the value of LNG on the water in Northwest Europe and gas at the TTF, gas in the market. And again, that was reflective of the fact that regas capacity was very scarce, and so the value of that regas capacity was very high, and that reflected the difference between those two prices. Europe has been very effective at very quickly building new regasification capacity. So in Germany in particular, but also the Netherlands, and new projects coming in Italy and France as well. And so actually the degree of success they've had building that new capacity means that those kind of disconnects are probably relatively unlikely in the future. Going forward, Giovanni said the actual utilization and how things play out is a little bit uncertain, but the truth is there is a lot more import infrastructure, or there will be a lot more import infrastructure in Europe than there has been previously. Sorry, Giovanni, to interrupt you. I'll let you carry on.
No problem. We can go to the next slide then, where we focus on the pricing impact of some of these dynamics, especially focusing on Europe. Now, we have reason to believe that the events of the last 18 months and the long-term implications will drive increasing volatility in prices within Europe specifically. This is for a combination of reasons that have to do, first of all, with the fact that Europe has lost a large volume of its flexibility in demand. Europe is much more reliant on LNG supply for security of supply. LNG is no longer just the marginal incremental volume that is being brought to balance the European market and that can be flexed upwards and downwards based on pricing levels. It is absolutely necessary to provide security of supply within Europe, and Europe has lost the flexibility it had to flex up and down Russian gas imports in response to specific pricing signals. At the same time, Europe will also lose some of the flexibility it has in its gas demand, specifically with less and less coal to gas switching on a purely economic basis being available, with coal generation capacity being progressively phased out, but also gas being potentially increasingly needed to balance an electricity system that is more and more reliant on renewables. So we have less flexibility in European demand, driving Europe to potentially lose the status, well, to lose the status that it had of the global sink market, of the market that was able to respond very rapidly and flexibly to pricing signals, flexing imports upwards and downwards. And this will drive increasing volatility in European prices and fundamentally make Europe more and more a price taker in the global LNG market. We also have the fact that supply and demand is increasingly, as time passes, more and more driven by purely political factors rather than economic factors. This is both from the perspective of policy driving more and more the evolution of the energy system, with decarbonization policies and targets driving the evolution of gas demand, but also geopolitics, as you've seen in the last 18 months, driving the availability of supply into the market. And overall, this makes it more and more difficult for supply and demand to respond to one another on an economic basis, and is a further driver of volatility. Now, we've talked about the destabilizing factors, but there are also some factors that might mitigate in the long term, and these are more uncertain. These are new developments in the market that we haven't necessarily seen yet, but that might mitigate the further volatility we see for European gas prices. This is the fact that while we've talked about how Europe will likely lose its role as global sink market, while this role may at least in part be taken by China, with China starting to develop some of the traits that allowed Europe to be the global sink market. And these are flexibility in demand, large oversized energy importing capacity, and large volumes of pipeline supply from Russia that allow to balance the market more easily. So China could potentially provide some flexibility to the market. And also, we've talked about the role that Southeast Asia, South Asia, traditionally price-sensitive, highly price-sensitive markets play in the long-term evolution of gas demand. Well, they also might provide further flexibility by being able to respond much more than Europe in their demand to global gas prices. So this concludes our overall look at the evolution of the European gas market, and we can then move into our fundamental conclusions for the outlook of the market. So first of all, we've talked about how there is a risk for the market to fundamentally overcorrect the reduction of Russian gas supply to Europe, to develop too much supply, LNG supply, too quickly, that may drive prices to very low levels for an extended period of time in the late 2020s. There is still a lot of uncertainty as to whether and how much this dynamic will take place, and this uncertainty is driven by the evolution of European and Asian demand in the short term. If we look then beyond 2030, the evolution of the global gas market and global gas prices fundamentally will be driven by the evolution of South and Southeast Asian markets as they become major demand centers. And the ability for these markets to develop their infrastructure to meet this potential demand, but also the ability of the global market to provide supply at affordable prices will determine the overall evolution of the LNG supply-demand balance, which will be fundamentally the driver for global and specifically European gas prices. We've also talked about how there is a challenge for new LNG supply to enter the market going forward. This challenge is being driven by the fact that the traditional business model to develop new LNG supply does not fit the transitional role that LNG could play in some of these demand centers, because LNG requires long-term certainty of demand for new supply to be developed. And we've also seen how there are new business models, there are new approaches that are being taken by developers of new supply to be able to manage this challenge. Finally, we've seen how we expect more volatility in prices, both on a short-term and on a longer-term levels, as we see large cycles of very high and very low prices, driven by the fact that supply and demand are less and less able to respond to one another based on economic factors. Political factors are increasingly playing an important role in shaping the evolution of the LNG market. So these are our four main takeaways for the outlook of the LNG market to 2040. If we move on then to the next section, we can look at how these key takeaways impact specifically groups of market participants. If we start first of all with gas and LNG suppliers, the outlook for the business for supplying LNG into the global market is being quite drastically changed by the events that we've just talked about. If we're looking at more uncertainty and volatility, then the traditional expectation for the LNG business to be one of long-term stability, predictable returns is increasingly being appended, and we have fundamentally more and more volatility, returns being squeezed in shorter periods of time. Returns may be higher, but they are no longer long-term predictable and stable returns. There's more uncertainty, more sort of a boom and bust cycle inbuilt into the global LNG market dynamics. Also, if we're looking moving forward into the future to a market that will struggle more and more to develop new supply, well, then having an already developed long position in the market will be increasingly valuable, and doing that as quickly as possible, getting the gas out of the ground as quickly as possible, will prove increasingly valuable going forward. Finally, if we're looking at someone who is willing to supply LNG into the global market, well, then it is developing a position in those markets that will drive global demand growth that becomes more and more valuable. And developing a position in those markets may require more direct involvement than other markets may do, because these markets require direct development of new infrastructure for demand to be unlocked. For example, we've seen the role that many LNG portfolio players are taking in developing LNG to power projects in a country like Vietnam, for example, really to grow that long-term prospect of demand and ensure that there is long-term demand to a sufficient level that that long position that has been taken becomes less and less risky. If we look at then at the next category, we have energy buyers. The energy buyers fundamentally have to manage the uncertainty that comes with strict decarbonization targets, especially energy buyers within Europe. And we've seen how there's an increasing level of partnership being taken both within Europe and in the global market overall to be able to manage this uncertainty. And the one fundamental partnership that enables this uncertainty is the ability of portfolio players to provide flexibility and to provide short-term supply deals to buyers without necessarily constraining the ability of new supply to enter the market. The ability of LNG portfolio players to take that long-term risk to manage the uncertainty is the key dynamic here. But also from the perspective of energy buyers, we see how if we're looking at a more volatile, uncertain market, well, then the ability to respond flexibly to market dynamics becomes more and more valuable, much more valuable than it was before. And we've seen, for example, the much more material interest that is being taken in LNG importing capacity, for example, or in storage capacity to manage this uncertainty. These are all infrastructure elements of the market, of the gas value chain that are starting to take more and more value in response to these dynamics. If we look then at energy importing governments, well, governments have a role to play in making it easier for importers to manage this uncertainty, to enable the development of the required infrastructure in the short term, in the right way, to manage this uncertainty, to manage this volatility without necessarily compromising the long-term decarbonization goals. And balancing these two contrasting challenges is where governments can help buyers in a way that would not be possible purely based on commercial drivers. Also, governments can play a role in developing appropriate investment frameworks for developing gas and LNG infrastructure in the right way, as I said, to balance these contrasting drivers of short-term energy security and long-term sustainability. Move on then to the next slide. We can see how LNG project developers are being impacted by these dynamics. And we've said it plentiful times already. It is going to become more and more difficult to bring new energy supply into the market. And as a response, LNG project developers need to find a way to adapt to the challenge of developing energy supply in an energy transition context. And this means being able to operate over shorter time frames, being able to take more risk directly, either by project developers or by off-takers, potentially changing the commercial structure of the project in a way that encourages a different risk-reward balance. But also, if there is only a limited number of projects that will be able to enter the market in the period to 2040, well, then those that do are likely to be those that are able to compete better with others in terms of the carbon intensity of the LNG produced. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment as to what value emission reductions will have in the LNG trade. There's no such thing as a trade, really, as a well-developed trade for low-carbon LNG cargoes, and therefore taking investment decisions based on these values, on these dynamics is particularly challenging. Nevertheless, whenever wins can be achieved at a low cost, these should be prioritized by LNG project developers, and we're seeing that already being done by most new projects that are close to taking FID. If we move on then to the next slide, we can look at how these dynamics are influencing lenders and investors. Now, from the perspective of investors, there is a fundamental challenge that new supply capacity into the market will still be required for the decades to come. And if this supply does not enter the market, then this will compromise the ability of some key demand centers at a global level to access affordable energy supply that can displace other higher carbon intensity energy supply forms, but also fundamentally unlock energy supply. And the fundamental challenge that there is in bringing this supply into the market is the fact that there is a fundamental ambiguity in the role of natural gas in the energy transition, because natural gas can play a short-term role of transition fuel in meeting this demand that we've just talked about for clean, affordable energy in the very short term. But this needs to be done in a way that is also mindful of the long-term dynamics of the energy transition and the fact that the natural gas business is drastically changing in its drivers and in its long-term dynamics. And addressing this ambiguity is what will enable the development of the investment in the right level of and the right projects to bring that supply to the market. And also, in the context of this ambiguity, there is a differentiation that is taking place between gas projects because of the way in which these projects address the challenge of operating in a transitioning environment, and the way in which these projects will or will not be able to be developed in such a way that enables an effective management of this long-term uncertainty and volatility and this changing role of natural gas in the energy mix. Finally, if we're looking at the value of existing investments, then something that previously might not have been such a significant value of driver, such as the resilience to volatility and to uncertainty, now becomes much more of a driver for value because, as we've talked about, the dynamics of the market are changing. We expect the market to be more volatile, and therefore the assets that are able to deal with this volatility better than others, then these assets will see an uptick in their value in the long term and in the ability to generate revenue for their owners. So this was all of the material from our side. This is our full long-term outlook for the evolution of the market. And I will now turn back to Peter for some concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giovanni. And while people are getting ready to ask their questions, as I mentioned before, please feel free to ask anything and drop them into the chat. Maybe just a few reflections from me to summarize some of what Giovanni has just walked us through, and particularly towards the end there. I think there's some very interesting dynamic at play, which is that the fundamentals suggest a continued role for natural gas and a need for natural gas to meet energy needs, including as part of energy transition in markets where coal is still a hugely dominant source of energy, so those markets of Asia in particular. But the dynamic there is interesting insofar as those are also markets which require that LNG to be delivered at a reasonable price, that gas and LNG to be delivered at a reasonable price. So affordability is a huge question, and the role that Europe is playing at the moment is disrupting global LNG markets. And the example was most stark last year, where we saw prices spike because European demand went very high, and that caused supply to be shifted away from Asian markets predominantly. And if you extrapolate that kind of logic going forward, if Europe continues to play a premium market role for a sustained period of time, there's a question about whether that disrupts the affordability of gas in some of those markets. And the likely response is more coal for longer. And so you get into an interesting question of aspirations around net zero and energy transition potentially having some unintended consequences of creating a longer role for coal in markets, and also undermining some potential for economic growth and access to energy in certain markets. I think there's a very interesting dynamic at play around European policy and European long-term approach to natural gas, and how that relates to those markets where natural gas is still seen as a huge growth potential. Final point that I think is interesting to reflect on, and Giovanni referred to this a little bit, that there is a bit of a rush at the moment to take FID in LNG projects, to get the gas developed, to get the molecules into the market as quickly as possible. And some good examples of that were the Qataris taking FID on over 50 million tons of new capacity without necessarily having long-term contracts signed up. Those contracts are now coming through, but basically a decision that it needed to have more molecules in the market. It wanted to have more supply in the world. And then you see the wave of US supply that's also coming through, predominantly underpinned by buyers from China and aggregators, so companies like Shell and BP and Total, who are taking portfolio positions and adding supply into their portfolios in the belief that they'll be able to secure markets for those volumes into the future. And there's something interesting in that about how the incremental growth of supply is being taken by a certain type of actors, and those are the actors that are gonna control the flow of molecules into the future. Okay, a couple of questions coming through. Let's start with the first one from Ludmilla, which is hydrogen and the EU backbone project. What's the impact of that, or what could be the impact of that? Do you want to first crack at that, Giovanni, and then I'll add some thoughts afterwards?
Yep. So the impact fundamentally of that project is as part of those dynamics we've talked about that will drive European gas demand down with time. Now, obviously, the actual timeline at which this project is developed and the extent to which it is developed will depend on the prolonged need for natural gas and the role of natural gas infrastructure. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty as to exactly how providing security of supply for natural gas and enabling supply of new alternative fuels will play out. I don't particularly see the EU hydrogen backbone project presenting a risk for natural gas security of supply because there's just no way to develop this project in such a way that would materially create risk for security of supply. I think by nature, this is a project that works with a certain degree of harmony with the decline of natural gas supply overall.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just saying. I was just asking you if you have anything else to add.
I was going to add that fundamentally, at the heart of that question is, what do you believe about the development of hydrogen in Europe? How much and how quickly? I think it is fairly widely acknowledged, certainly in natural gas circles, but it's fairly widely acknowledged that the targets that set by the EU, the aspirations that are embedded in Repower EU, for example, are very, very aggressive, and the possibility of the European hydrogen market developing as quickly and as significantly as that is probably quite low, for a combination of two fundamental factors, which are the most fundamental factors: supply and demand. Can you develop enough hydrogen quickly enough, economically enough, and can you get buyers and markets and move it from the point of development to the point of consumption at scale? And the truth is that hydrogen is still feeling its way from an economic point of view, still needs to go a long way to be more affordable and just to make sense economically. There are still some technological questions. What's the best way of transporting it? What's the optimal way of using it? How will you buy and sell it? Who will underpin the value chains? Who will assure the cost of development of all of the pieces of infrastructure and so on? So the hydrogen backbone in Europe, I think, will happen. It is a project that has enough political will and enough political support behind it that it will happen, and the role of hydrogen in Europe will increase over time. But the pace and the scale of that development, I think, is still hugely uncertain. And you know, natural gas will continue to play the role it plays at the moment, really, for as long as, until that point that hydrogen really starts to materially pick up. So I think it will happen, but it will probably happen more slowly than the EU would like it to happen, and it will probably happen at a lower volume level. The build-up will be shallower, I think, than the aspirations around it. Second question, Giovanni: is there a risk that Southeast Asia and China bypass gas and go straight from coal to renewables? That's a really interesting question, and it's one that that we are wrestling with and asking ourselves at the moment, because I think there is a risk of that to some extent. There is a risk to that, and I alluded to this in my wrap-up comments. There is a risk to that to the extent that alternative gas supply is not affordable. there is undoubtedly a price bracket and affordability bracket that some of those markets operate in. And if LNG is too expensive and it's not available at those sort of costs, then it won't get bought. And you see that in the dynamic of the spot market, again, as we saw last year, when spot prices go above a certain level, certain markets simply don't participate, and they consume something else like coal, or they don't consume energy at all, and they have a major problem. They have an energy shortage problem, which we saw in places like Pakistan last year. So it is a risk. That being said, there are ways, I think, of managing that risk. We often think about LNG, global gas, especially in Europe. We fixate on the spot price, and we think about the cost of LNG or the price of LNG being $20, $30, $40 as it went last year, or $10 as it is now, an MMBTU. And we think of the price of LNG in those terms. But most markets in the world don't operate like that. Spot LNG forms a relatively small part of the total mix, and they're underpinned with long-term contracts and long-term contractual positions. So, for example, China is securing huge amounts of LNG supply on a Henry Hub price basis because the Chinese buyers are directly purchasing from US projects. So their cost of LNG shouldn't be as high as Europe's cost for LNG, simply because they're directly accessing those prices. In Europe, the participants that access those prices then sell the LNG on and the gas on at TTF at the market price, and so they capture the benefit. I think if you're a consumer in one of those markets, you can go and get cheaper LNG. You also still see oil indexation. I think some of the recent Qatari contracts being signed into South Asia are oil indexed. So there is a risk, and there is a risk to the extent that the affordability becomes a problem. But there are also ways of assuring supply that doesn't expose those buyers completely to the same kind of price risks. In essence, I think the other point to make out is that gas still has a role to play around rapidly responding to things like air quality challenges. That's still a big driver for some gas demand growth in those markets. So renewables probably don't happen quickly enough or at scale quickly enough to solve that problem. So gas still has a role to play there as well, I think. So it's one of the big levers of demand uncertainty as you go out into the future. I think at the moment it probably is. Gas still does have that role, but it's one of the things to monitor in the next few years, I think. I don't know, Giovanni, anything you'd add on that?
Yeah, I'd just add the fact that we should be careful on applying sort of our own inbuilt European perspectives on some of these markets, where yes, there is a risk that an accelerated development of renewables limits the long-term prospects for gas. But nevertheless, we're not really talking about a picture where gas completely replaces coal on a one-to-one basis, and there's still scope for material development of gas consumption within these markets, even if gas maintains a fairly small percentage of the overall picture, because these markets are markets that have large untapped energy demand potential, and this is the largest driver for growth in gas demand, not necessarily a one-to-one switch from coal to gas. And finally, if we are to look at a picture in which gas plays a much smaller role in these markets, that we have a more straight coal to renewables switch in the longer term, then we're looking at a picture in which there is a combination of much higher emissions and lower energy demand being met in these markets. It's not necessarily a different way of achieving the same objectives.
Yeah. We got a few minutes left, and I want to answer Andrew's second question because I like these sorts of questions. Any curveballs out there that we should be aware of and watch out for? Let me give you two, and then I'll let Giovanni do the same. There's an obvious one, which is last year 120, 140 BCM of gas was taken out of the global supply mix. Russian pipeline gas that was flowing to Europe is no longer flowing to Europe. That gas is not going anywhere else at the moment. That is a net loss on a global scale basis. If for whatever reason some or all of that gas re-enters the market, either through détente with Europe and we see pipeline flows again, or maybe slightly longer term, it's supplied into the market, into China or somewhere else, that has the possibility of accelerating any potential overcorrection in the next 5 years. It might be another source of additional supply entering the market in the mid-2020s that I mean, if anything, probably see prices go even lower. So that's one thing that could happen and should be watched out for. Basically, how does that ultimately play out? And then the second one, which is a slightly more out there, but you may recall from one of the early slides Giovanni showed, the US is by far the biggest incremental supply source for new LNG. And there are other LNG prospects around the world, and there are other places that can add supply, but the US has the largest amount, and it's the easiest. It's the most straightforward place to develop new export capacity. If at some point in the future, for some political driver, perhaps there becomes a cap on how much LNG the US wants to export, and it decides that there's a limit and it doesn't want to do any more than that. It's not the way it is at the moment, and there aren't necessarily indications that policy is going there. But if that were to happen, I think we had 150 additional million tons per annum coming out of the US in the next 20 years. If that gets capped off before that does create, I think, a slightly different supply availability dynamic for LNG, and basically pushes us up the cost curve a little bit. Giovanni, anything else? Any other curveballs to think about?
Yeah, I would absolutely echo what you've just said in terms of US energy supply. All of our assumptions for the long-term evolution of the market are based on that, in a similar way that our assumptions for the evolution of the European gas market were based on the continued availability of large volumes of Russian gas. So that would have a massive impact on the evolution of the market, and probably rather than maybe not necessarily pushing us up the cost curve, it would just mean there's not enough LNG available in the market to meet all of that demand potential that we've talked about. Perhaps the only other point I would add is the uncertainty for the long-term behavior of China, and the willingness of China to continue relying on large volumes of LNG imports for its supply, a large percentage of these imports coming from the United States. Any further escalation of geopolitical tensions then may cause a retreat of China from the LNG market, and again, cause a significant shift in our outlook for the market, which is based on a sustainment of and a material growth of LNG imports from China.
Brilliant. Thank you all. We're nearly out of time. I just want to add a couple of final things, or direct you to a couple of final things before we wrap up. If we skip to our final slide, you will see there is a QR code that you can use to access or to sign up to Baringa's Energy and Resources Briefing. This is basically a newsletter of sorts, so all sorts of content in there that will be sent out to you periodically. If you scan that QR code, you can subscribe, and I believe the next issue is due to be released in the next few days, so you should get something fairly quickly from that. Also, this has been recorded, this session, and you should get an email shortly after this is finished, which give you a link to that recording, so you can rewatch me and Giovanni to your heart's content, and you'll have that in your inbox quite soon. And then finally, just to flag to you another one of these webinar sessions coming up in the next few weeks on the role that Texas may play as a hydrogen powerhouse. So we've done a lot of work recently looking at Texas and other provinces around the world and their hydrogen potential. So there's a session coming up in the next few weeks on that. So please keep your eyes open for that. Otherwise, simply to say thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Hopefully it was worth it. And a final thought, that if you have any questions or any follow-ups you'd like to address to me or Giovanni, or you want to explore the more detailed analysis and work that we have that sits behind all of this, please feel free to reach out to us. You should have our contact details, and yeah, please feel free to drop us a note. Thank you very much.